We are now going to cover some simple modifications and guidelines for using backpropagation on real data. The first variation on backprop we will talk about is the difference between batch and stochastic optimization. Batch learning is where you have a set of training data and you update the weight using the gradient computer after presenting all of the training data to the network. The gradient is computed by presenting each individual data point to the network and then summing up the gradients for each data point into one, and that is the gradient that is used to update the learning rate, update the weight matrix. And the learning rate here, we should note, is specified by the Greek letter eta. Stochastic gradient descent, on the other hand, does the weight update after each data point is presented. This has the advantage of turning the learning algorithm into an online algorithm, which is to say that it can continue to update the weights while the network is in use, and it does so in response to new data points that come in. However, stochastic gradient descent does have the problem of potentially making weight updates more variable and taking longer, conceivably longer, to find the optima, although I should specify there is no necessarily a guarantee that stochastic gradient descent will take longer to find the optima. As a side note, a modern technique for doing the gradient update is to use mini batches of data, which is to say batches of data that are larger than one data point but smaller than the entire data set. And generally you can use whatever works quickly on your computer. And this has the advantage of sort of striking a balance between the smoother trajectories in weight space from batch optimization and the spikier updates from stochastic one element stochastic gradient descent. Another modification of the backprop learning rule is the introduction of momentum. To motivate the use of momentum in an algorithm, we should look at how the learning rate affects the optimization process. Here, these ellipses are giving the isoclines of an energy function or an error function over the space of weights. If we start at point A and we use a small learning rate, what we'll see is that we take a lot of steps, very small steps, to finally get to the optima in the center of the plot. If we have a larger learning rate starting at point B, which is a symmetrical location to point A in the error space, we see that we take big steps that actually go back and forth. They cross the optima at multiple points here, right, all of these crossings of the optima. And so there's actually a lot of lost, unnecessary work done in this optimization routine, although it does, in this case, get to the optima in fewer steps than the small learning rate. There's a lot of overshooting, and in fact, in a more complex energy space, you could overshoot the global optima and end up stuck possibly in a local optima. So what we want to do is have some combination of a smoother trajectory, but also getting to the optimum in fewer steps. And momentum is a way to smooth out the optimization process by making the current weight update at step n, a blend of the weight update computed as a function of the gradient of the energy function, and combining that with the previous weight update from step n-1. And we can see the effect of the momentum on the optimization process by looking at the trajectory of the weights that start at point C and move smoothly and quickly towards the optimum. More recently, an optimization routine called ADAM, which stands for Adaptive Moments, has achieved widespread popularity. ADAM is an algorithm that computes its moments as a weighted average of previous gradients, where the weighting decays exponentially back in time. When training deep networks pragmatically, ADAM is a good algorithm to use, although it does possibly require modification of the learning rate. And for more information on ADAM, see section 8.5 of the Deep Learning book. However, that particular algorithm is outside of the scope of this course. As we discussed in the last chapter, the number of hidden units is important. Even with backprop, we can get overfitting of the data. And one of the ways we can test for overfitting is, or more importantly, to figure out what is the right number of hidden units, we can look at the performance of the neural network as we vary the number of hidden units. So what we see here in a graph on the x-axis is the number of units in the hidden layer of the network. Every cross represents the result of an optimization, or the test error from an optimization with a randomly initialized set of weights in the network. And as you can see, when the number of neurons is 1, the error is high. As you increase the number of neurons in the hidden layer, the error improves significantly after just going from 1 to 2, although there are still some worse performing networks. Then once we get to 4 neurons, we can see that the error is quite tightly packed and low. But then as we increase the number of neurons in the hidden layer, the spread of the terminal error of the networks after training starts spreading out again. And this is a symptom of overfitting. And I should say this is the test error after training. And so if we're going to find the quote-unquote right architecture for the network, we need to explore the space of these parameters to get something optimal. Although, as you can see, the difference between 4 and 5 neurons is not quite so bad. Once you get to 6 or to 3, it gets a little bit worse. But the point to be taken is that there's a range of good and bad parameters, and you want to be on the good side, and you need to explore the space to find that. Another way to get overfitting in your data is to overtrain, and that is to say you continually present the same data to the network until it memorizes just that data. And so it thinks that whatever data is in the training set is basically the universe of discourse that the neuron will be operating in. And that means it stops generalizing to other data as well. So one way to avoid this is an algorithm called early stopping, which is to say you want to stop training before you start overfitting the data. So a way to do the early stopping algorithm is you maintain your training set and then a separate, completely disjoint validation set. And at the end of each epoch, you report your training error, and as you see, it decreases as we would expect with training. And then you also evaluate the validation set at the end of every epoch. And like the training data, it decreases with training until you reach a certain point where it starts increasing again. And once the validation error starts increasing, that's when you know you're starting to overfit and you want to stop the training process. The backpropagation algorithm is really the workhorse of neural networks, artificial neural networks, and learning in artificial neural networks. But even when it first came out, it started producing some very impressive results. In the original paper, they managed to use backprop to train a neural network that could learn the relationships in family trees. And this result shows the benefits of using distributed features to do this kind of learning. And we'll get more into distributed versus dense features in the next lecture. But this is an algorithm that was, could originally be found in the 1960s, but we're learning this structure and we're learning to predict what is the relationship between individuals very early on. Another early application that was very interesting is the case of learning to play backgammon. So in 1989, they trained a network called Neurogammon that used a dense representation of the backgammon game, which is to say not just a picture of the board, but a representation that engineers designed. And they trained this with lots of examples of correct play on the board. And they had a network that with only 80 hidden units managed to be reasonably successful at the game. And then in 1992, they further developed TD gammon, which uses reinforcement learning to train the network, and the network actually got better at playing games by playing against itself. And this is a strategy that is used in the Go games, Go playing algorithms that were developed by DeepMind and Google. And like the algorithms from Go, these backgammon playing algorithms have changed how human experts play. And in many respects, the seeds of the Go game are planted here in the Neurogammon and the TD gammon algorithms, and it really was just we needed more compute power and to really make a more efficient learning algorithm. or rather a network that was more efficient to train than your standard neural networks. And this is going to lead into convolutional neural networks, which we'll discuss in the next layer. But these will help us make networks that have even more sophisticated power than just your standard multi-layer perceptron. Backpropagation is a very impressive algorithm. As I say, it's the workhorse of artificial neural network learning. But this is a computational neuroscience course, and we should take the time to ask ourselves, is this a plausible algorithm for learning in the brain? And strictly speaking, it isn't, as it's encoded with this, this symbolic representation of the weight update rules. In the brain, learning is happening locally at the synapse. But what these weight update rules that we have derived, they have global knowledge in the form of the error function at the output of the network, and then the synaptic weights of neurons between the neuron you're currently training or updating and the output of the network. And with this algorithm, it's just sort of magically accessible to every neuron in the brain. And if we're going to explain this as a biologically plausible form, or if we're going to develop a biologically plausible form of backpropagation, there needs to be some mechanism for transporting error information and the weights of the synaptic weights that are downstream back to the synapse that is being modified. And there is ongoing research into how to implement biologically plausible backprop. This is a hot topic right now. But perhaps one of the more interesting results comes out of the work on feedback alignment developed by Lillicrap et al. In 2016. And what this shows is that we can actually use random backpropagation, or random projections back through the network to carry the error signal. And this obviates the need to know the value of downstream synaptic weights. And there are also in the brain a large number of feedback connections. In biological brains, there is a large number of feedback connections which may be able to play the role of this random backpropagation. But this is a really impressive result, because it means we can start to look at getting deep learning, as I say, learning with networks of multiple layers of neurons, without necessarily needing to know the gradient of the response of the neurons downstream, and without needing to know the weights of the response downstream. We just need somehow to get this error signal back to the neuron that needs to learn. So to sum up, today we discussed the backpropagation algorithm and how to use it to learn useful features for doing classification or regression. And this is a general algorithm which can extend to networks of arbitrary depth, although, as we will discuss next week, there are pragmatic limitations on that. And we have also covered some useful tips for working with backprop, or how to make it a little nicer. And with this material, you should be able to do question 3 of assignment 1. Interesting projects that could be done could be the replication of classic backpropagation experiments, or we could compare variants of the backprop on a particular learning task. So you might want to compare standard backprop to feedback alignment. In the next lecture, we will cover convolutional neural networks, which are what are responsible for the major improvements in image classification that we've seen in the last decade, and are really a very powerful tool for doing learning in neural networks. But more importantly, their design actually originated in the analysis of the visual cortex. And so this is a nice closing of the loop between neuroscience and machine learning. So thank you all, and we'll talk again soon.